and then he'll... Okay. Well, I'm very impressed with those of you who came out on this very cold evening. It shows your dedication to learning about what's happening in the world. I'm to introduce Peter, and I feel very privileged to do this. I'm probably the only person besides Jan Flora who had the honor of working in a building at Kansas State University with his father, Frank Orazem, and got to know him and his mother very well. He was also he was more of an ag economist, but he was still very helpful, particularly when I was working on the roots and consequences of the farm crisis. And then we come to Iowa State. Nobody was there when we were at Virginia Tech, but when we came to Iowa State, there was Peter Orazem, who does even more spectacular economics work. And what I really like about the work that Peter does is that it ties various fields of economics to policy. And I think that's what we really have to be considering as League of Women Voters, is if we know this, what would we do differently? And I think Peter will really help us move that way. He's done research all over the world. He's published incredible amounts of scholarly articles, but often co-authored with all sorts of people from all over the world, including his students. And I find that very impressive. So without my further going on and on about the Orazems, here is Peter.
Well, thank you. I should say something about my mom, since she was a very strong proponent of the League of Women Voters. And when she passed away, one of the things that we had put on the funeral announcement on the obituary was, in lieu of flowers, you could give money to the League of Women Voters. And afterwards, they told us it was the best fundraiser they had ever had. We offered to hold another funeral, but they said one was plenty. And then on my dad's side, he was the longtime precinct committee man. We voted in the water plant, which was a really spooky place, because you would walk in, it's really dark, and then you'd look down and you could see all this water down below. It turns out that in Kansas, when you register for the Democratic Party, they just make you precinct committee man on the presumption there won't be any other Democrats in the precinct. So that's some stories about my folks. This is sort of some of the things that I'm hoping to talk about, and I'm going to start with the last one. Actually, is as I'm going to show you, we really haven't had much experience with inflation or high interest rates for a very long period of time, including the people in the Federal Reserve. You have a lot of economists now who have never seen inflation, and now they're trying to grapple with that. But you have a lot of businesses who are used to relatively low and stable interest rates. You have financial institutions that have been making loans without worrying about whether or not there was an unstable value of the dollar. And I think some of those things we're going to be struggling through. When you look at the overall economy, you can really say, I mean, this is like Dickens again, right? A Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times and the worst of times. I'll show you some data that looks as good as any data we ever have within an economy. And we have other data that looks sort of the reverse of that. And I think the truth is somewhere in between those things. I think the underlying forces for the economy are quite strong, except for the fact that we don't have enough people to fill the economic needs that we have, and that's very unusual. And I'll try to explain why we don't have those people. But this is the shortest recession we ever had. Literally, it was 2 months. In fact, they were tempted not to call it a recession, except that we had double-digit unemployment, so they figured they had to call it a recession. And so if you look at those sorts of pictures, how rapidly the economy recovered, we look quite strong. On the other hand, if you look at employment and other measures like inflation, then we have things that look much more concerning. And some of these are a response to the pandemic very early on, and I think some of the early responses have had much longer repercussions than what anybody would have imagined at that time. And I'll try to explain a little bit as to why the Federal Reserve is finding it extremely difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, right? Why is it that they're having trouble trying to reduce inflation? So we'll start with the good news, and then I'll depress the hell out of you after that. So if you look at, I mean, here's why they called it a recession, right? We went to 15% unemployment in a month. We went into the recession with the overall unemployment rate at 3.5%, the Iowa unemployment rate at 2.5%. The most recent numbers for September, we're pretty much back where we were. And in fact, if you look at how rapidly unemployment returned to its pre-pandemic levels, this is 2.5 years. So just for reference, if you look at the Great Recession, it was 7.5 years before unemployment returned to its pre-recession levels. And here is, I think the reason I'm asked to give a lot of talks now is because I'm old enough to remember inflation. I was hired at Iowa State in 1982. Our first house we bought, the interest rate was 12.5%. We got it on an adjustable rate mortgage. And luckily, the interest rate went down. It could only go down 0.5 point every 6 months. It went down every 6 months. It went down 0.5 point for as long as we owned the house. So our mortgage when we bought the house was $1,200 a month, which was a lot of money at that time. Luckily, my wife had a job. I think it pretty much was my salary. And then, but when we sold it, our mortgage was under $300 a month. So that'll give you some sense as to what the conditions were at that time. If you look at GDP growth, we were chugging along fairly nicely and until March of 2020, and the bottom falls out. But we're back to trend growth of GDP, if you just continue that along, within 5 quarters. So if you look at the actual length of the recession, we fell for 2 months and then we went back, right? So the shortest recession we've ever had. And you have to think about that because what we really had wasn't a true recession. The economy was in relatively good shape. It was, the reduction in production was because we shut things down, not because there was a fundamental weakness in the economy like in 2007 through 2009. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we try to figure out why what ended up happening turns out to be inflationary in terms of the government response. So, things look pretty good, right? We're producing a lot of stuff. We're certainly producing more than we did in the fourth quarter of 2019. We had a little bit of a hiccup with a couple quarters of negative growth, but very small amounts. And then the third quarter, we're back up in positive territory again. Although that we may have some additional clouds on the horizon going forward. So why aren't we happy? And one of the reasons is because of what's happened to labor force participation. So if you look at the labor force participation rate, we have as many people working now as we had before. We actually have a few more. I think at the federal level, at the national level, we have about 0.9% more people working now than we had pre-pandemic. But if you look at trend, we're nowhere near where we ought to be for trend. So we're about 1 percentage points below where we ought to be in terms of labor force participation and in terms of the employment rate, the share of the population that has jobs. And that may not seem like enough, but you know, we're a very big economy. So 1% of employment is 3.4 million people. And so one of the things we have to figure out is where those 3.4 million people went. And so we'll try to figure out that. This is a rather busy slide, but what it shows is turnover. And what I want to do is to contrast what happened during the Great Recession with what happened in this pandemic. So what happens in a recession? Well, the hiring rate goes down, right? The job opening rate goes down. The layoff rate goes up. And the quit rates go down because people don't want to quit jobs. And then you look at what happened in the pandemic, and the numbers as of July, and I use that because I'll show you what the Iowa numbers look like in just a bit. The quit rates rose. The job opening rate is the highest we've ever had in history. The hiring rate no longer has any relationship to the number of job openings, and the layoff rate is historically low. So these are what the numbers look like. So here is the pre-pandemic monthly average going back to 2012, and then you can see what the numbers were like in July of 2022. And effectively, what's happening in Iowa mimics what's happening in the US as a whole. The first thing you'll notice is that on average, we would add 5.6 million new job openings a month pre-pandemic. We're now, in July, we had over 11 million job openings. That does not sound like a recession, right? We're hiring more people than we did pre-pandemic, okay? It's just that a lot of them are switching jobs from someplace else. So the quit rate is higher than it was pre-pandemic, right? So wherever that went, okay? And you can look at what's happening in Iowa. It's roughly the same thing. Where quit rates are about 43% higher than what they were before. If you look at what normally happens when you have a job opening is you fill them in that month. So the unfilled job vacancies are about 7% pre-pandemic. In July it was 43%. So 43% of the jobs go unfilled. And a lot of those jobs are being filled by creating vacancies someplace else, right? Because people are quitting one job and going to another place. If you look at why people are separating, quits are a much higher fraction of the total than what's true. So from this, you would say this is a very strong labor market, right? Firms are adding a lot of jobs. They can't find enough workers. Everybody who wants a job can find a job. And in fact, if you go back to the unemployment rate, what is the lowest unemployment rate we could possibly have? We have a term in economics called the full employment rate of unemployment, which sounds like an oxymoron. But what it is because we allow people to quit and we allow people to enter, and it takes a while to find a job, there's always going to be some frictions in the labor market where people are leaving a job and trying to find another job. And so those sorts of vacancies, we can say that, well, if you have as many jobs as there are people who are unemployed, that must mean that's about as well as you can do in terms of the unemployment rate. We have twice as many vacancies as the number of people who are unemployed right now. So we cannot get much better than this unemployment rate, and yet we're not hiring enough people. Okay? Oh, by the way, if you have questions, just ask them now. We should have time afterwards. So yes, go.
So are you going to get to the number of deaths because of COVID and how that impacts on this?
Almost none at all. Okay? In fact, if you want, I can go. Who actually was affected by COVID is not the people who are in the labor market necessarily. They're going to be people who are older, right? So if this is very different. The Spanish flu atypically hit working age people and younger, okay? This atypically hit people who are at retirement age, okay? If you look at the people under the age of 50, it's maybe 7% of all the deaths in the US. And if you look at the they have what they call a case fatality rate, so how many people die relative to the number of people who get the disease. We can actually look at what that looks like by age if you want. So this is across a whole bunch of different studies. The fatality rate for people who are older this is in log terms, right? So 0.1%, so 10% of the people who got the disease at the age of 75 succumbed to the disease. If you look at people who are younger, say in their school age, this death rate is about 1,000 times higher than what the death rate was for younger people. And so COVID did not really affect the working age population that much. That doesn't mean it didn't affect anybody, but it means that it didn't affect them as much.
When you get a question from the audience, can you repeat it?
Oh, I'm sorry.
People at home.
Okay, sorry. Well, whatever the question was, how much, I went off. So let me see if I can find where I was here then. Okay, so here is Iowa's labor market. I will get back to age here when we get to Iowa, because Iowa is atypically behind the rest of the country. So if you look at the labor force participation rate for the U.S., number one, the labor force participation rate in Iowa is higher than it is for the U.S. It has been for a long time, for both men and women and for all age groups, and I'll show you what those numbers look like. But we are 2% below what the labor force participation was pre-pandemic versus about 1% for the U.S. as a whole. So why is Iowa not in as good a shape? So one of the things you can look at is what the labor force participation rates are in Iowa versus what the labor force participation rates were for the same age group and gender nationally. And what you'll see is atypically we are in the labor market.
Yes.
Okay? And atypically our labor market is older than the labor market nationally. Okay? If you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you're in Iowa, you're in the labor market. If you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you're in Florida, you're retired. Okay? That's why when you look at how much labor force participation changed in Florida, it didn't change that much for older people. They weren't working, they weren't in the labor market. But in Iowa, they were, and atypically, they dropped out of the labor market during the pandemic. So you can look at what happened nationally versus what happened in Iowa. Some of these are likely to be mistakes because men and women in their 40s and 50s are at their peak of their earnings. If you drop out then, it's going to be very difficult to find another job that will pay you what you had because a lot of your wages were tied to the specific knowledge that you had on the job that you had before. So some of the surveys are finding out that people in these age ranges who dropped out are now a little bit, I mean, their 401ks went up by 35% in 2020 and 2021. We didn't have a lot of inflation at that point. They thought they could play out the string. And it turns out now they'd like to go back in the labor market, but the job that they had is no longer there, and so they're having some problems. If you look at young people, labor force participation rates for younger people in Iowa actually went up. And so where we're losing workers in Iowa is people over the age of 45, and that's where most of the reduction in labor force participation occurs. And to your point, that is likely to be not because they died, because they're nervous about being in the labor market. The other thing that people don't talk about, but it is equally important. Remember, we're about 3.4 million workers below where we ought to be on trend. 1.8 million are people who normally would have immigrated to the United States, but the pandemic shut down immigration. We have done nothing nationally to try to, say, beef up H-1B visas to try to replace those lost people. So, for example, we had a student who was a double major in economics and aerospace engineering. She had lots of interviews, but she was a citizen of Sri Lanka, and no one would hire her because they didn't have an H-1B visa available. Iowa has fewer H-1B visas than they have on the coast because we don't have very large firms. And firms have to be large enough in order to qualify for an H-1B visa. If you're in Iowa and you have 20 employees, you may not find the person you need, and then your H-1B visa goes begging. And so one of the things we might want to think about in Iowa is pushing for pooled H-1B visas for the state so we can compete on an equal footing with the very large firms on the coasts. 1.8 million is about half the missing workers. So immigration is about half the reason we're not where we ought to be, and the other half is we're a relatively older population, and it's the older people who have dropped out of the labor market. The other reason we need to worry about this is Iowa's atypically homegrown, right? So we have the 9th highest rate of people living in the state who are born in the state. I was born in Ames, right? My dad was a PhD student here when I was born, so I didn't actually grow up here, but I'm one of the 69.7%, even though I didn't really. I was 9 months old when I left, and I was 26 when I came back. But we're not a state that attracts a lot of people from other places. So if you look at the places that do, everybody in Nevada apparently wasn't born there. They just went there, they lost all their money, and they can't leave, is I think how that works. I'm not sure. But people in the Midwest basically don't attract a lot of people, and so we are atypically having to bring people in from other places. And we have to remember that sometimes, I think. Now, inflation. We need to find out, number one, why there's a drop-off in consumer confidence in the United States. And this is the point I was making before. Nothing really happened to inflation for 36 years, okay? The Fed set the target at 2% in 2012, but that was pretty close to where they were for the previous 10 years as well, okay? And so it was a pretty easy job to be in the Fed for most of this, or maybe they were just doing a fabulous job at meeting their targets, right? Then this starts to happen within about 7 months of the pandemic, and they thought, well, this is going to work its way out, and it turned out it hasn't. And so that's what we have. If you look at, this is the Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey, so they've been doing this for a very long period of time. This data goes back to 1978. Before that, it was quarterly, and so this is the monthly data. You'll notice that the levels of consumer confidence are below what they were during the Great Recession, okay? We only had a 2-month recession, okay? But inflation eats into your ability to plan. And so people get nervous about buying big ticket items when they don't know what the value of the dollar is going to be that they're repaying, or they're going to get nervous about investing. Okay. And it's especially bad when inflation is below the wage growth. So at first, we had that wages were rising more rapidly than inflation early on in the pandemic, but for about the last 18 months, inflation has steadily been faster than the rate of wage growth. It can't happen forever, and so you know that at some point wages are going to be adjusting upwards to meet that inflation, but that wage price spiral is what we had in the 1970s, and ultimately that led to the very severe recession in the 1980s when they finally said we had to put the brakes on inflation. We may be going back in that direction now.
Peter,
Yes.
why, when there's inflation, does the Fed think raising the interest rates will stop it?
Well, in this particular case, the question is, why does the Fed want to raise interest rates to defeat inflation? One of the things that I'll show you in a bit is what happened to labor productivity. Okay, so why is it we had such stable values of inflation over this period of time? One reason was we had very robust labor productivity growth, which means for the same hour of work, you're now producing more stuff, okay? So that holds down price increases, even though people are being compensated for their productivity. Labor productivity has actually declined over the last 6 months. So that's one problem. A second problem is we have 3.4 million fewer people producing stuff than we ought to have, which means we have less stuff to buy. And I'll show you now why there's a lot of dollars chasing the less stuff to buy. So the only option they have is to try to do something to reduce the consumer demand side, because nothing is helping the supply side right now, okay? Some of it is the often talked about supply chain problems, but the biggest supply chain problem is you have 3.4 million fewer workers producing stuff. And so their only option is to try to suppress labor demand. And another problem is that the federal government, the fiscal side, is not making their job any easier. And I'll show you what those numbers look like in a second. So we had a recession in 2008, 2009, and the federal government increased its expenditures to try to shore up demand, as they did. And you can look at what happened to transfer payments as a percent of total income, and it went up like this, okay? And we called that the Great Recession, okay? We had a recession that lasted 2 months, and you can look at what happened to transfer payments as a share of total income. So that's, transfer payments are getting payments for not producing stuff, and this is compensation, so this is what's happened to the share of your income for producing stuff. And if you look at this relative to this, if this was the Great Recession, this seems a little bit out of line, okay? If you look at transfer payments as a percent of total income, in 2020, total incomes in Iowa rose 9%, which is very robust. We have very rarely get that kind of an increase. 93% of the increase in income in 2020 was transfer payments, okay? If the reason for transfer payments was to shore up demand, look what happens to the savings rate at the same time. A disproportionate share of the transfer payments were pocketed. We couldn't buy anything, right? We shut everything down, so that's part of it. But another thing is that we didn't target those transfer payments very well. So they didn't necessarily go to the people who needed the money, which is why a lot of it ended up being saved. So this is some work by David Autor and a host of other people who I don't know on how did these different stimulus package, the unemployment insurance, the transfer payments, and the Paycheck Protection Program, how did it get distributed by income quintiles, right? So unemployment insurance, well, you can see that atypically the dollars went to the people at the lower tail of the income distribution, and it's still in the second quintile, and paradoxically, similar amounts go to the upper tail of the income distribution, and this was because they made unemployment benefits available to self-employed people who normally don't get unemployment. You don't unemploy yourself, right? You don't pay into unemployment insurance if you're self-employed. But so that's what happens with the income distribution in terms of unemployment insurance. If you look at PPP compensation, so we put a lot of transfer payments into firms, and some of that was designed to shore up wages, okay? And you can see that's the dark boxes here, where the dollars went for the compensation part of that. And the other part of that is the compensation that went to the firms for keeping them from going out of business, right? They went to capital income, and you can see disproportionately the benefits are going to people at the upper tail of the income distribution. We also had these stimulus checks, 14,000 I think went to households with $150,000 or less. Now the median household income in the US is $71,000. So they're putting transfer payments out to people who probably didn't need the money. And you can see that that's pretty much equally distributed until you got high enough income that you didn't qualify for those checks. Okay? And if you look at that and you say, okay, some of this stuff was targeted, the only thing that really looked like it was well targeted was the unemployment. The rest of it was put out into the economy with the idea it was going to stimulate an economy that fundamentally was not unsound, right? The reason we had the recession was because we shut down parts of the economy, and those parts of the economy were able to reestablish, except for the hospitality industry, relatively rapidly. So, classic old fiscal macro stuff, right? The federal government has been 21% of GDP on average since the end of the Vietnam War. Okay, it's been roughly at 21%. If you look at the Great Recession, it plops up to 24%, and then they sort of undo the stimulus, and it goes back to 21%. And then we have the pandemic, and you would see that this response seems out of line with what they called the Great Recession. I mean, it's a massive increase in the amount of money that's being transferred to households in that period of time. These were, if you remember the shovel-ready projects, that terminology went to producing stuff. This atypically went to not producing stuff. So there's a lot of dollars being put into households with no concomitant production occurring on the other side. Okay, so you've got a lot of dollars. Not only that, but we started projecting. This is what the projections were. I mean, this is a bipartisan mess up if you look at that, right? So we started doing this in the Trump administration. We just carried it forward. But if you look at what's going to be happening going forward, we're going to have a constant increase in the share of the federal government relative to GDP. Now, why is that a potential problem? You can view that as having to transfer resources from doing something else in the private sector to now doing something different in the government sector. And transferring labor, transferring capital, transferring technology from some sectors to other sectors is extremely expensive. The research that they did in the 1980s, where they had massive transfers out of manufacturing at that time, caused because a lot of firms went out of business. We used to produce tires. We used to produce a lot of other stuff that we ended up not producing. That led to persistent inflation as well as unemployment in that period of time. We have something similar going on here, except it's a government-driven shift of resources away from some things to other things, and that's going to be a constant source of inflation for as long as we keep increasing the federal government share of GDP. And we've locked that in now. I mean, they would have to have Congress actually vote for something to undo spending, which has not happened in my lifetime as far as I can remember. So, what is the Fed doing? So, over this period of time, this is the Great Recession, by the way. So, money supply plops up and then we undo it. Okay? And this was the response to the Great Recession in terms of the money supply. What's happening with the Fed is the government wants to borrow money, so the Treasury issues bonds, and the Fed bought all the bonds. Okay? And that's how they kept the interest rate from rising. They didn't let the bonds go into the private sector, so they didn't hold an auction, they just purchased them. And this is the balance sheet of the Fed, and you can see that it started to go up. And their idea was they were just going to let these things expire, right? They were going to mature, and that was going to be the end of it. But then the massive increase in spending happens, and the Fed accommodates it by buying all those bonds. And the money supply ends up way up there, right? So this is a threefold increase in the money supply relative to what happened in the Great Recession. I'm not a monetary economist. I never believed any of that stuff, but this looks concerning, right? Massive increase in the dollars that are loose in the private sector without any production going on, and that's where the inflation starts to come to play. The other thing that I want to point out is this is the long-term, here's what happens to total hours, the red thing. Here's what happens to compensation. And compensation and productivity basically track one another. Some of the productivity goes to capital, but a lot of it goes to labor. If you focus just on the more recent period, this is what's happening to labor productivity. We really didn't have a decline in labor productivity like that until what's been true recently. And labor productivity is what saved us for a lot of this period of time in terms of trying to reduce some of that inflationary pressure that would have been caused by these increases in the money supply. Well, we don't have that happening now. So that's why the Fed is stuck, right? They're stuck with a huge amount of debt that they're trying to accommodate, and they're also stuck with the fact that they don't have productivity on the other side, building more stuff, given that we have fewer workers. Okay? Maybe we will eventually, maybe we'll be able to innovate our way around it, but so far it hasn't happened. Okay, COVID. Okay, there's a trade-off. And we have 50 states, and 50 states did 50 different things in terms of how they were going to respond to the COVID. And Wallet Hub, oddly enough, has this index, which looked promising to me, on which were the most restrictive and which were the least restrictive states. Mainly this is related to their school policies, how quickly they reopen their economies, particularly how quickly they reopen their hospitality industries, and other things like that, okay? And you'll notice that as you go from least restrictive to most restrictive, you get a reduction in the illness rates, although there's quite a bit of noise, and you get a reduction in the death rate, okay? But it's also the case that if you go from the most restrictive to the least restrictive, you're also going from the most vaccinated states to the least vaccinated states. If you want to look at the relationship between how restrictive the states were and the death rate, for example, if you control for the vaccine rate and the age distribution of the state, that explains the death rate. Whether you are restrictive or not has no additional explanatory power. And the reason is, if you go back to how we were trying to manage the pandemic, we thought we were going to have a vaccine coming in about, December of 2020, January of 2021, okay? That was the optimistic, and it turned out we met that. The idea was to flatten the curve, try to hold things back, and then once we could get vaccinated, we would be able to reopen the economy, okay? Some states did that, some states kept their restrictions on much longer than that. They also tended to be the states that had the greatest vaccine rates, paradoxically. If you look at the states that open the economy, so those are the circles, so those are the least restrictive states, and the asterisks are the most restrictive states. Atypically, the states that rebounded in terms of their labor force and employment are these states. Some of them did very well in terms of death rates. Some of them didn't do as well in terms of death rates. Iowa did about as badly as any of the states in terms of replacing our labor force and replacing our employment, even though on their index we had the least restrictive policies in the country of the 50 states. Okay? And I think this is our age distribution. Okay, Utah is a very young state, Idaho is a very young state, Montana is a very young state. It was easier to reopen if you had younger people who were less likely to have serious consequences as a result of the disease. And so these, like the District of Columbia, kept their schools closed for almost 2 years. Yes, they had I don't think, where do I have any, I don't have it shown out, but I mean, they really lost a lot, okay? They also lost a lot because the federal government didn't reopen for a long time. And so all of those people who used to be in the district, you know, making use of restaurants, bars, hotels, all that shut down, and the district is paying a big price now because these things are persisting, okay? So If you lose your hospitality industry, it's going to take a long time for those things to come back. So, Iowa. Is Iowa lagging the rest of the country? Yes. Is the lack of labor force going to be a problem? Yes. Are some cities better off than others? Turns out, yes. Okay? And some sectors are better. Manufacturing, non-durable goods manufacturing in Iowa, the food industry has done remarkably well in this period of time. Okay? So we have more jobs than we had pre-pandemic. Durable goods manufacturing, we have more jobs than we are pre-pandemic. So manufacturing, and people don't know this, we're the 4th or 5th largest in manufacturing as a share of the economy. I was number 5, okay? And so it's a key sector for us. If you look at finance and insurance, we're doing better, and of course, we'll show you the Des Moines numbers in just a bit, but that's good, right? Some of the other things, not so hot, right? Retail trade, we're lagging the rest of the country, and some of this is related to the massive shift toward e-commerce over this period of time. And so the coasts are benefiting from that, mom and pop places are not. And in fact, this is employment and not gross state product, general merchandise stores are doing great. Walmart, Hy-Vee, non-store, or the retail as a whole is doing much worse, right? So we're losing sort of boutique retail, and a lot of it is going, this is what happened to employment in non-store retail. We only have national numbers, we don't have state numbers for that, but there's been a massive shift. If your retail establishments can switch to e-commerce, they can do okay. If they don't, they can't. So Chipotle, which delivers, their stock price went up 33% in a month, in the first month of the pandemic. Retail places that didn't deliver, like Ruby Tuesdays, shut down, right? They're no longer in business. Ames is doing great. So we have 2.4% more jobs than we had pre-pandemic. There's only one other place in Iowa of the metros that has more jobs than they had pre-pandemic, and that's Des Moines. All the rest of the state metro areas are lagging the state as a whole. And the key area, you don't see the details here, but the hospitality industry is in private service providing. The cities that shut down their hospitality industry most aggressively, Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, are finding it hard to get those things reestablished. Iowa City still played football, but they didn't allow anybody in the stands, right? So that makes it a little bit difficult for hotels to make money. You can still make money, however, in Las Vegas, apparently, on those games, so you can do that. Dubuque, heavily reliant on hospitality industry, and that's dragging down the rest of their economy. You can see that overall, the U.S. is at 1.3% in terms of private sector growth, and the state of Iowa is down about 0.1%. So we're still behind, but the biggest reason is because we just don't have the workers. It's not that we don't have the labor demand. If you look at wages, Cedar Rapids and Iowa City lag the rest of the state in terms of wage growth. Inflation's at 15.4%, so real wages in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City have fallen about 10% in that period of time. Ames, once again, is doing pretty well, okay? And then you get wage growth in all of the sectors, but the biggest wage growth is at the lower tail of the distribution, where it's the hardest to find workers, right, in the hospitality industry.
What's your guess of why Ames is so high?
Why is Ames so high? We have one big advantage, and that is that we have one of the highest shares of college graduate and above workers as a share of the total population. And those people atypically were able to work from home. And so if you look at the employment rate by education group, the groups that really got nailed were high school and below. And the groups that did not get nailed were college graduates and above. So I think one of the reasons you see, for example, increases in female labor force participation rates in Iowa is because of the ability to work from home. And that doesn't happen if you've got a job where you're in retail or you're face-to-face service. So that's one of the reasons. So who are the biggest employers in Ames? The university, the hospital, government sector, DOT, okay? That helps, okay? And I think it helps a lot. We didn't lose as much of our hospitality industry also because the Big 12 kept things open and the Big 10 shut things down. And so I think that's part of the difference between Iowa City and Ames. But Ames has been doing better. You worry that this could be, because the university is the wild card here, right? Because we started losing employment at about 1,000 students a year. I used to, when I was on city council, I would say, there's no way that they're going to reduce the size of the university because the university can't afford it. Well, it turns out the university can't afford it, but they put their foot back on the gas now recently, and so we're beginning to grow the freshman class, but you have to do that 4 years in a row in order to get back to the numbers that they had. So one of the reasons why our government sector looks good here is 2019 looked bad. And so it's not that we have more jobs now relative to 2018, we have more jobs relative to 2019 because the university was beginning to shrink and now we're beginning to work our way back up again. So I don't know if that, but I think that part of it is the mix of those jobs. Okay, so storm clouds. Iowa absolutely has to get immigrants. And nationally, we have to get immigrants because I'm convinced that if we're going to solve the inflation problem, we have to solve the supply chain problem, and the biggest supply chain problem is labor. And we're not going to solve that problem, by having more babies anytime soon, right? So immigrants are the only source, or older workers are going to come back in the market, which may happen, but it's not happening fast.
Some of the meat packers are employing children.
Well, I don't think the meat packers are employing children, but
They are. They have been. They found them. At night.
kids 16?
14.
14.
14.
Well, okay. Well, we may have solved the other problem is we can use child labor, but
Wait, actually, I can't. So
I'll go with this one. The factors, the labor supply problem is not going away. The federal government has not shown much fiscal constraint, so that's been a problem. And we've got a labor productivity problem, which may or may not reverse, but since it's unusual, it's a little early. But the factors that the Fed has to deal with to combat inflation, as I said, they have very few options other than trying to reduce demand for goods and services. One of the things we have to worry about here is because the federal government borrowed so much money, there are now interest rates, just interest payments on the debt are going to be in excess of $1 trillion this year. That's 4% of GDP, okay? The share of the federal government that can go for discretionary spending is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And with interest rates rising, the sorts of things that we worry about here in terms of federal funding, I think those things are going to be drying up. Government state the rate of return on stock went down about 9% in the last fiscal year ending June, and underfunding of state pensions, state and local pensions, went from 16% to 21% in 1 year. So you're going to start seeing pressure for states to have to raise taxes in order to make good on their underfunding of their state pension systems, state and local pension systems. And I have some numbers on that if you're interested. And then retail, a city like Ames, we want to be exciting, we want to be novel, but retailers who cannot make the switch to home delivery are going to find it extremely challenging, I think. People changed how they're shopping. They may change back, but they're changing back extremely slowly. So they're changing back rapidly enough for Amazon to lay off a bunch of people, but they're not laying off their home delivery people. They're laying off some of their mid-level management type people. That's what I got. Anyway, thanks. Any questions? Yes.
So I have been, in fact, I cried both times that the Fed raised the interest rate because of the project I'm working on. We did means financing. I laughed today when I got home and saw CNN had run something about mortgage rates that had come down an entire half a point. Now, I do understand that's home mortgage. I was so excited. So now I came here and you depressed me again. I'm not crying yet though here, but okay, so can you explain a little bit more about why you feel interest rates are going to continue to rise and yet we have like this bump all of a sudden that's brought down mortgage rates?
Well, they might not rise, but I don't think they're going to fall as rapidly as you might like, right? And I mean, here's an interesting thing, right? So here is the value of the dollar. We have inflation. And yet the dollar is increasing in strength relative to the euro, relative to the yen, relative to the pound. And you go, okay, how is that possible? Now, just to scare you a little bit, one of the things that benefits us is commodities. International commodities are denominated in dollars. So stronger dollars mean our oil prices are lower relative to Europe. Our metals are lower relative to Europe. Our food grain prices are lower relative to Europe. Okay? Now, is this going to stay forever? I don't think so. And when that reverses, you're going to see upward pressure on oil and commodities again. Okay? The only place where we've seen reductions in inflation are in energy prices. Okay, and that's from a peak in July. But that's not that great, right? They're still way up relative to a year ago and way up relative to 2 years ago. And I don't see that's going to change. I think one of the reasons we have the benefit is because the dollar's stronger. Okay? Why is the dollar stronger? It's because inflation in Europe is worse than here. Why is inflation in Europe worse than here? It's because they had negative interest rates forever. We had positive interest rates. Where are you going to put your money? In Sweden, they had a policy that if you overpaid your taxes, you would get a refund and they would pay interest. They had a massive increase in the number of people overpaying taxes in Sweden because that was how they could get a positive interest rate. Okay? So you look at this and you go, okay, that's why this is happening, and that's why part of the reason why energy prices went down. And maybe that's why there's a brief respite on mortgage rates. But I don't see the rest of those problems, particularly the labor supply problems, going away. And I just don't think that it's going to take us a long time to unwind all of those dollars that ended up being put in the private sector. We saved them and now we're spending them. The other problem we have is one of the reasons we've been able to not have as much inflation is we're drawing down inventories. We've been drawing down inventories for 18 months. We're not going to be able to draw them down much more, right? When a lady ran into my car from the back, so they totaled it, so I had to buy a new car. Well, I couldn't buy a new car because I didn't have any new cars, so I bought a used car. I paid $8,000 more for a 3-year-old Toyota RAV4 with 40,000 miles than any car I've ever bought. That's what they had, right? So we're beginning to run into problems in terms of inventory, and that's also going to start raising prices.
An online question.
Yes.
Please comment on any effect of corporate price increases / profit taking on inflation.
Okay, not much. If all they had to do was raise prices, where they've been for the last 36 years, right? So the big reason, for example, why are oil companies making profits? Well, they lost money for 2 years in the pandemic, and now there's a sudden surge in the demand for oil, and they are able to draw down inventories, okay? And so I think the profit picture for corporations is going to go down. The group that sort of came up with this was the Employment Policy, EPI, Employment Policy Institute, or the Economic Policy Institute, and they really cooked the goose on that. So they started their numbers in the second quarter of 2020. The wage increases were in the first quarter of 2020. If you just change the quarter to the first quarter versus the second quarter, most of their argument falls apart. So I don't think that, if corporations were able to just charge prices, they should have been able to figure it out for 36 years when they didn't. Yeah.
Weren't wages relatively flat? The rate of growth of wages have been relatively flat in the United States for the last 30 years. That would leave little opportunity for corporations to increase their prices. However, if there's enough money in the economy now for people to vastly increase their savings rate, wouldn't there be then a concomitant opportunity to raise profits at this time?
It might be. And the question is, are you measuring profits in nominal dollars or real dollars? And I just don't know that one. I wanted to show you what the relationship is between compensation. So here's compensation, is the blue line. This is real compensation per hour. And here is productivity. And the correlation between them is around 0.9 something, okay? So one of the reasons why wages are flat is compensation, which includes benefits, are a much larger share of your total package. And particularly health insurance has been important, and it rises more rapidly than inflation. Also, compensation, this is the court case, right? The Donald Trump court case. The guy was paying himself in tuition and housing and stuff. Benefits are not taxed. Wages are taxed. And as you increase, because on average, people have been moving up. One of the reasons why the middle class is smaller is, actually people have moved into higher classes, although the definition of middle class is a little bit tenuous. People prefer to get their additional dollars in untaxed benefits, and so that's one of the reasons why that's happened. So you get a different story if you look at compensation in total in real terms relative to wages.
What people prefer to get their compensation
In benefits?
over
That Trump employee certainly did, right?
No, that's not a choice. It's not a healthcare. If you get your healthcare through employment,
Yeah.
it's not a choice.
No, but
You cannot
He would-
convert that
he was the
into.
one that was keeping the books. So he,
No.
No, but she's saying in general that if you can switch jobs, right? You can go to places that offer less compensation if you want in benefits and more in wages if you want. It just turns out that people have, they're voting with their feet, right? So the share of compensation as a share of total has gone up. And that's what it is. And so if you want, you can get a straight time wage, but it's not. People tend not to want those jobs. There are people who will stay in work because of the benefits. They don't want to lose their health insurance.
That's different. That's not a choice of choosing money over benefits. It's a choice that's so constrained that it's certainly, I would argue, it's not a true choice.
Okay. Yeah.
You talked a lot about the fall in productivity hasn't kept up. Can you explain a bit more what it is? Is the composition of what we're producing changing? So let's say productivity in services.
I don't know. Okay, so the question is, why is productivity going down? And I don't know. I know that it had to go down because I saw that we had 2 straight quarters of less productivity and employment had gone up. I can hazard guesses, right? So a lot of people are switching jobs, and if it takes a while to learn the new job relative to what you had before, that might be part of it. But this is so unusual that I don't know what would be driving that, right? We're so I mean, here, let's look at what the pattern has been for productivity over, and this data set goes all the way back to 1947. And I mean, if you look at an hour of work in the US, the average worker is producing 3 times more stuff, whatever, in real terms, than what they produced in 1947. If you go back to 1900, we're producing 6.5 times more stuff. Okay, so we've been phenomenal. I mean, this has been our story, is productivity. I mean, this is only 3 straight quarters of productivity decline. But we just haven't had that, and I don't know why.
If you have a higher share of the economy going to produce medical services or in some of those areas where it's harder to achieve increases in productivity, that might contribute.
Let me see if I can hazard a guess as to where we're not producing is in stuff that usually you didn't think of as that productive, right? The hospitality industry, arts and entertainment, and government. And it's not that maybe government is real productive, we just don't have a way to measure it, right? So the way they measure output in government is input. These are not supposed to be the most productive places, and we're producing less there, versus places where you see increases in productivity. I don't know. I mean, it could be that, a year from now they'll correct the data and, it'll turn out not to be there. I don't know, but I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question regarding measuring inflation year to year.
Okay.
Let's say you have 1 month of very high inflation. That 1 month is going to show up negatively for the entire next year, even if there's no inflation over that year.
Right.
That's skewing the picture.
Sort of. I worried that this initial surge in inflation was because there had been a little bit of a decrease early on in the pandemic, so prices went down. And so if prices go down, then a year later, it's going to, and certainly you had that in the Great Recession, right? So we actually had negative growth in prices. And so this inflation that occurred coming out of the Great Recession was in part the drop in prices during the recession, not any systematic increase in price levels. But this is an increase in price levels. So I held off on some, I did a blog where I just said we're just going to hold these prices at their pre-pandemic levels, so we're not going to allow the inflation to look artificially large because of the decrease in prices there. You still started to see inflation at the rate of 4% relative to pre-pandemic prices as early as about 8 months in, so that would be probably January of 2021. And then it's just increased since then. So yeah, you're exactly right. There's a way to fix it by just not letting the deflation early in the pandemic affect the inflation rate, but you get almost the same
Or
story.
even 1 month of very high inflation.
Right.
And you'll see that for the entire next year.
Yeah, except you go year to year, right? So you go month to month. I mean, anyway, you get the same story if you just don't allow the deflation to occur.
If there are no more questions, we're going to dissolve this formal discussion, but Peter is willing to answer other questions if you want to come talk to him, right?
Sure, and I can send slides if you want.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that was a very evocative and informative presentation. Thank you so much.
I would.